Hello everyone, Argent here. So a friend of mine had posted this. This is a supposedly more non-biased version of the fascism test. For those of you who aren't aware, the fascism test was basically something developed by, I guess you could say, left-wing psychologists as an attempt to pathologize right-wing political views, although I never actually score that highly on it, strangely enough. That's probably because I have very kind of divergent views on things. Like, I support authoritarianism, but I don't support a police state or domestic spying. I don't think people should vote, but I think people should own guns. So those are kind of the contradictions in my ideology, which means I never... Well, not really contradictions. I mean, I can kind of reconcile all of them, but... Yeah, so let's see here. So, they claim that this is a lot more, non-biased. So let's just go through this. I'll take the test. We'll see how fascist I am. And we'll explain my questions. Question 1 of 28. In the end, economic and technological strength cannot compete with the spiritual strength of a people that has faith in their country. I don't think it's an absolute thing, because obviously a lot of the indigenous peoples had a lot of strength, but they still lost in terms of the colonial powers. They still got completely wrecked. Japan eventually lost World War II, but I do think it's immensely important. I do think it allows the people to punch far above their weight, and that warfare is to a large extent a clash of wills, so I'll somewhat agree. Organizations like the Freemasons and similar secret lodges cannot be trusted since they have their own agendas. I agree. I'm Catholic, so we're kind of the ones who invented the Masonic conspiracy theory, and it's kind of an every time thing. Freemasons are always involved in shady shit. When it comes down to it, politics is mostly about the distribution of money, materials, and resources. People's value and religion are just icing on the cake. Now, this is an interesting question because this is kind of normative. I don't know if this is a normative question. Like, what do you think in your world politics should be about, or what are politics actually about? Especially in a democratic society, I think this statement is 100% true. I view democracy as a nihilistic system where people gain power so that they can loot the state and the portions of society who didn't vote for them to enrich their partisans. Ideally, though, I think politics should be about the preservation of a people in terms of their genetic and cultural resources. So I'm going to go with somewhat agree, because I do think that this describes politics. But it's not kind of how I morally see it. The mode of organization employed by the military is an efficient one, and institutions like schools, the police, and firefighters could generally benefit from adopting more of the military's practices and discipline. Now, I've worked in schools before. Kids love discipline. I've worked in a couple schools where there's teachers who were army brats, and they kind of ran their class as military. I mean, they didn't, obviously hit the kids, and they weren't, cruel to the kids, but overall, they had a lot of discipline and structure, and kids crave it, and they really appreciate it. So yeah, I think to a certain extent, so long as you don't go crazy with it. Politicians have a responsibility not to upset the traditional ways of communities they live according to their time-honored customs, values, and creeds. Yeah, I think Mark Levin really said this good, where he called them temporary politicians. He said this in the context of Obamacare, where the Congress that passed it no longer existed, but the Supreme Court voted to uphold it. You can particularly see this with referendums, where 50.1% will decide the entire fate of a country. And once, if Scotland was to declare independence, there would probably never be a rejoin the UK referendum. So, yeah, it seems weird that 51% can dramatically alter society for all time. And you can very often never have another vote on it. The free market is the most efficient way of organizing the economy known to man. I don't know, socialism doesn't work. I know we all want to LARP and we want to go, oh, Hitler, his economy was so great. Generally speaking, market economies work. Socialist ones do not. Obviously, the state has an important role, kind of directing the economy, making investments in key sectors, building transit and other infrastructure. Like I said, investing in technology and research, maintaining stability, enforcing contracts, trying to ensure a nation self-sufficient, at least to a certain extent. But generally speaking, yes, a market economy is best. The economic losses from worker strikes and employer lockouts are just too massive to allow market forces to sort these things out by themselves. Yes, I do think government has a place mediating. It's, in a lot of cases, I mean, it does very much go both ways. I mean, we don't really have strikes and employer lockouts that often anymore. But you'll have organizations like the automakers where they gave absurd benefits to the unions and that partially made them uncompetitive and collapsed. But I've worked for a lot of companies where it works the other way, where the workers are completely treated like dirt, and they deserve more money and they deserve better benefits and working conditions. So yeah, I would say the state has a role in it. I'm not going to go like everyone should. I'm kind of moderate on this, I guess. There is no universal ethics. What is true and good for one people may be false and bad for another. Now, this is a tricky one. Once again, are we talking morally or practically? Perhaps I kind of have a skewed view of this because I'm a social scientist. Maybe that's pretentious of me to call myself that, but my degree's in political science and I work in public opinion. And to a certain extent, policy. I do definitely think there is a universal moral compass. Killing people, unjustified homicide is always bad. Rape is always bad. Depriving someone of their property unjustly and illegally is always bad. And I don't think that really matters on the society. At the same time, though, people tend to have the society they need and the societies they deserve. Like in a lot of Islamic societies, the people don't have a lot of agency and they don't have a lot of impulse control, and very rigid social structures and guidelines are necessary to maintain order and to maintain a functioning society. So I think morally this is true. Politically and practically this is 100% false, so I'm just going to go with the middle. Ethics is a matter of statecraft. Whatever furthers the interests of the state are good. Whatever inhibits it is bad. Once again, this is a question of practical reality versus politics. Or I guess you could say pragmatism versus normative ideas. In general, I think it is the state's primary duty to further the interests of the nation. Machiavelli once said that only princes should have the privilege of lying. To be a king, to rule your people, is to make the kind of harsh, morally ambiguous decisions that would cripple lesser men. So I do think, to a certain extent, when you come to running a state and having to compete against others and having to fight wars and make hard decisions, this is true. On the other hand, I do think ethics is kind of beyond it. So I'm going to mildly agree. In the context of government, which I have to assume the question's asking, people shouldn't be allowed to spread dangerous political beliefs or ridicule those with whom they disagree without the permission of the proper authorities. I've evolved my opinion on this, but I'm still nominally in favor of free speech. There's a lot of things that I just don't think should be permitted. Like, for instance, with Melissa Harris Perry, she made that video saying we need to accept the idea that children belong to everyone and they don't belong to their parents. We have the Toronto District School Board who talked about the necessity of protecting children from their parents. We have antinatalism. We have there's a lot of just ideologies like that. We have Peter Singer talking about euthanizing disabled people. I'm fine with those people just not being permitted. I think it's mainly in extreme cases and it's mainly in public. I don't really support arresting anyone for what they say in private, unless it's like they're planning to like overthrow the government or something. But yeah, I don't mind censoring some extreme cases. Classical liberalism is essentially an ideology of the past, and modern attempts to reinstate it are bound to lead to wars. It's an interesting question. I don't know if they're bound to lead to wars. I think it is kind of tone deaf in the modern era. Part of why it kind of made sense in the past was because the government, the world's governments or the world's landmass was normally controlled directly or indirectly by a small group of nations who all kind of shared similar values to a certain extent, a similar culture and related languages. And that made the whole kind of process of global trade a little more practical. But in general, I do think it's kind of outdated and outmoded. Warfare is the only state that truly shows you what a given people is made of. I think it's kind of the, how should we say it, indication of the strongest a people can have. It's kind of a supreme expression of their will to endure and their will to conquer and their will to power. On the other hand, it's not the only state. People can show what they're made of through art. I think if you go to Italy and you look at something like Venice, you look at the Duomo, you look at all the beautiful buildings, I don't think you can see that and say, oh, these people, we don't know what they're made of outside of war. I think you can very clearly see what they're made of. I think through America's massive advantages in science, Japan's massive achievements in science and engineering, you can also see what people are made of. So I'm going to say neutral. It's not logical or efficient to have several companies all making the same tire, the same wrench, the same cable. No, competition makes things more efficient, generally speaking. Democracy is dangerous to competent statecraft because it forces every political decision to be lowered to a level of stupidity that the masses can understand. Yes, democracy is a system based on the lowest common denominator. If a people hasn't accomplished much throughout their course of their history, that tells you something about the worth of the people. We've talked about this before. I agree 100%. To view consumer goods and an increased living as standards as ends in themselves is a sign of moral corruption and decadence. I disagree. I think in an excessive amount it is. I think if you're like, oh, I think that better movies is kind of nice, refrigerators, stoves, central heating, plumbing. I think if you view all these things are bad, and that's a sign of decadence, you get India, which doesn't have a functioning sewage system or electrical grid in most places. People who seek happiness through money and material comfort will never achieve it. I think that's true to a certain extent. I think I agree with Common Filth that you have to put your faith in that which does not change, in that which is eternal. But I mean, certainly you're a lot happier if you don't have like a bunch of bad diseases and you can pay the bills at the end of the month. The individual is more important than the state. It's a difficult question. I kind of take a balanced view of it, I guess. A person who has nothing to hide has nothing to fear from government surveillance. That's 100% false. There's often really corrupt people in the government. Especially in the current system, the government would probably arrest people like me for our political views. Also, I just don't like the idea of them storing everything about your life. It prevents people from ever making a fresh start. It prevents people from really living their lives. So I'm against government surveillance. I mean, obviously, if it's like, oh, this is a drug cartel, or oh, we think this person's a murderer, and you get a court order from a judge who says, well, I've reviewed the evidence, and the evidence really clearly seems to indicate you have a good cause. All people are essentially worth the same, no matter their race, gender, nationality, or IQ. Now, in a spiritual sense, they are. It's still wrong to kill someone, even if they're of low IQ. But if we're talking in the political and social sense, then no, they aren't. And worth the same is an irrelevant statement. It's not. It's like saying a American dollar and $1.40 Canadian are essentially worth the same, but they are different. They can buy different things and they're used in different countries. If a state is to protect the freedom of its citizens in the long run, the state must be free to make controversial or unlawful decisions when necessary. Yeah, I mean, I don't really dislike the Constitution, but it's not a suicide pact. I mean, if you sometimes have to intern people who you think might sympathize with the enemy, if you sometimes have to break laws to stop terrorists, so long as it doesn't get out of hand, I mean, like I said, it's not a suicide pact. The struggle between rich and poor, between the capital owners and the laborers, is a more significant driver of history than the struggle between nations. Completely disagree. Running a business is not very hard, and as a rule, the business owner doesn't possess any special skills they're not also possessed by his workers. I've known a number of people who run small businesses. I don't know if I could do it myself. The amount of time, drive, talent, and commitment it takes is something very few people have, in my view. The individual cannot really claim any rights against the state, since it is the state that grants him these rights in the first place. Once again, this is a question of, I tend to believe that our rights come from God and from natural law in terms of their justification, but in reality it is the state that grants you rights. You don't have a right to life really unless there's a police force, and there's kind of societal norms that enforce that. You don't really have a right to property unless it's recognized legally, and once again the law and police system recognizes your property. So I'm going to say it's kind of in the middle. Politically speaking, the state is a second-order consequence, the direct effect of people laying claim to their homelands and flourishing there. Yes, if the state didn't exist, we would have to create it. It's just necessary, especially in a modern sense, to do things like the army. With how expensive and complicated modern military technology is, I don't think you could leave that up to private corporations. Plurality of political parties is necessary to ensure that no one circle of individuals gets too complacent in power. I disagree. It depends upon who's in power. I think corruption is the bigger issue here than who controls it. The political challenges of today are so serious that they can no longer be solved within the traditional paradigms of political thought. Depends on your definition of political, but if we mean left-wing and light left-wing, I agree. Honor and worth of people is proportionate with the contributions it has made to global civilization. Yes, I agree 100%. Okay, so I got 63% fascist, which probably makes sense. I'm not a hardcore totalitarian, but I certainly have leanings in this direction. So that makes you a crypto-fascist. So let's see what it says. It would appear that there is a significant degree of agreement between your preferred political doctrines and those of fascism. Since fascism is a mix of communism, socialism, conservatism, and liberalism with a few innovations of its own thrown in, it is scarcely surprising that most people's outlook will have quite a few similarities with the doctrine of fascism. However, even with this, the most likely interpretations of the answers on the test is that you're someone who's on the verge of being a fascist proper. Not inaccurate. Nevertheless, it depends on which type of fascism. I kind of like more the Christian ones with a lot of kind of Anglo influences, so I don't really like totalitarianism, I don't like government surveillance, I don't like the police state. Let's see here. Showing a significant percentage of population is naturally attracted to authoritarian political doctrines, of which fascism is but one example. In fact, one study even found that in the case of people who are drawn to order and control, these values are more important to them than mainstream political parameters such as the traditional left and right. In all likelihood, these values are among the most important ones to you as well. Yes, I agree. I actually don't think this is a bad test. If you want to take it, go ahead. I'll post a link to it and share your results in the comments thread. Everybody have a good day, and as always, God bless.